So within the overall field of conservation right now, there's been an increasing focus on ecosystem service in support of human well-being as opposed to simply the conservation of biodiversity. And in fact, CI has changed its mission from one of conservation of biodiversity. About 3 years ago, the alteration in the mission was to conserve biodiversity, ecosystem services, for its impact on human well-being. So this is a simple graphic of our theory of change, which actually applies across lots of organizations. We take actions that we hope will affect the health of ecosystems. However you would like to define health, and you could do it in a number of different ways, just as you would define human health in a number of different ways. But at least ostensibly, we would take a set of actions that would conserve, maintain, or improve ecosystem health. We expect that will have an impact on ecosystem services, which hence will have an impact on human well-being. Again, the details of defining each of those boxes is an interesting area that we're currently working on. In fact, my group is working on and testing different approaches in Madagascar at the moment. There's an example here for freshwater, but of course it's most important to look across a set of ecosystem services, not at each service individually, because they're not orthogonal, they're not at right angles to one another. And it's also important to come up with indicators in each of the boxes, if you like, of the theory of change. That's a fairly concise set. Many of the studies that have talked about indicators for ecosystem health have come up with this enormous list, 100 different things that you should measure, which in a policy context actually isn't very useful for two reasons. One, it's very difficult to absorb, and secondly, because people will choose the indicator that they prefer. And say, well, but in my context, I'm doing extremely well because we can see that the soil nitrogen has increased. And that's not very useful out of a very long list of 100 things. On the other hand, if you can come up with 5 or 6 indicators in each box, perhaps a longer list of ecosystem services, then you get a general sense of direction as opposed to an extremely narrow evaluation of ecosystem health. And again, think of the human health analogy. There's a few indicators that tell medical doctors where to look, but they don't necessarily tell everything. So every time you have a physical, they do the same 5 things to start the physical, but then if they need to explore deeper, of course, there's lots of other tests that can be done. Having that kind of a metric of whether in fact we're making progress, our actions have had any impact, is quite important in a conservation context, and you would think that it would be a normal course of business, but in fact it isn't, for lots of reasons, which we probably could discuss for a while. It hasn't been the case that people have consistently measured conservation effectiveness for ecosystems, services, and human well-being. And while we and others are working towards that end now, it's actually a pretty interesting area to try to come up with the measures that are responsive, but not so highly variable that they become meaningless, nor are they so stable that it doesn't really make any difference because the indicators never change. And I'll show you some examples at the end of the talk on something called the Ocean Health Index that makes some steps in this direction. In the Hoffman paper, we also looked at what would have happened. The red line is what would have happened without conservation action. So while there's still a decline, you see that in fact conservation action can make a, I would argue, significant difference when you look across the entire red list data set in slowing that decline. It hasn't by any means halted the decline, but it is possible for conservation action to slow the loss of species.